Good evening and welcome to another episode of Media Matrix. I'm your host, Gregory Golda, from the School of Communications here at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. Joining me today to talk about the latest in politics, technology, and pretty much anything else that interests us are two journalists. The first on the left here is Professor Rick Falco, who has had a long career as a photojournalist for the likes of Time and Newsweek. And to the right is Professor Joe Alicastro, who has had a 30-year career as a producer for NBC News. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
It is great to be here with you. So my class will take over the show at the halfway point, and we will have a panel discussion with Professor Kathleen O'Gara, who is from the Political Science Department here at Sacred Heart University as well. So let's jump right into things. The first things first, let's get a pulse on the political race of 2016. We've just finished up with the Wisconsin primary, and we're going into New York. It is a critical state for both races, the Democratic and Republican race. So on the Democratic side, it's an absolute must-win for Senator Bernie Sanders to stop the momentum that Clinton has as what seems like the inevitable candidate. And on the right, Ted Cruz just won Wisconsin, which was an upset to Donald Trump's momentum as well. So you guys have been covering politics a long time. For me, this is kind of a bonkers political season. I have no idea what's going to happen. Do you have any clarity?
Well, I covered virtually every election from 1984 to 2008. And so I didn't miss leaving covering politics until this year because it's a hell of a story, and I wish I was out there covering it. Having said that, now that we move on to New York, the headline in the New York Daily News for Ted Cruz this morning was, "Take the FU train." So I don't think he's going to do too well in New York.
He got savaged yesterday when he was visiting the Bronx.
Yeah, in fact, he's running dead third in the Republican side for the New York primary, according to the polls anyway, if the polls are accurate. Donald Trump, it's his home. You know, this is where he lives in New York. He had a huge rally in Bethpage last night. There were some demonstrators against him outside, but not as many as were anticipated. He'll probably do very well in New York. Kasich will do a little bit better than he's done in some of the previous races. And then we move on to the Democrats, and that's really, I would look to see Bernie Sanders come on strong in New York.
The polls are closing. They're getting closer.
Yeah. Hillary Clinton, of course, makes her home in New York. She was a senator of New York. She was well-liked and reelected as a senator of New York. And Bernie Sanders is a native of New York. Of all of the three New Yorkers, he's the only one that sounds like a New Yorker, being from Brooklyn originally. But we'll see. I think it's going to be an exciting race. I think Donald Trump is headed for a good run here. We've got a lot of primaries that are coming up, all in the Northeast. And after the Northeast, we move on to the West, and that's when Cruz will have another run.
Are there two Americas?
Oh, for sure. But as we look also particularly at the Democratic primaries, I think it's important to look at now how the demographics are going to fall, particularly, I think, in favor of Clinton. Sanders has been able to really excite people who are below 30, right, who the polls all show don't actually come out that well in the general election. Also, he's appealing to states, particularly in the last 6 or 7 primaries, that actually lean much more to his idea and philosophical view.
California.
But what you're going to see now is New York, Pennsylvania, California, New Jersey. The demographics have changed in terms of the diversity of people who are going to be participatory in the process, and that leans strongly to Clinton. Now, what happens here is going to be important because if Sanders does really make a big surge, like particularly in New York, that's going to change a lot of things. That said, I think in the long run, Clinton is still going to be that front runner.
Let's take a little poll from our audience here by applause. How many of you are voting Trump? Okay, round of applause. Cruz and Kasich. There's one. Okay. We should do this by hands because it's really demoralizing to listen to the applause level, I think. And then Clinton and Sanders. Okay. Okay.
Proving Professor Falco's point, under 30.
Right. So there is more of a majority looking at what Sanders is offering there. So after another month or so of this, does the Democratic Party suffer irreparable damage because of what's happening between Clinton and Sanders?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the Democratic Party will unite. They haven't had the kind of backbiting fight that the Republicans have had. And I think that if Clinton wins, Sanders will support her, and he'll throw all of his, not only his support behind her, but he'll really encourage everybody. His wife was on Brian Lear's show last week, and she said she will go out and campaign for Hillary Clinton. She was asked that question directly. So I think the Democrats will definitely unite. On the Republican side, it's a different story. But my main concern is if you look at the spectrum of politics and those that are left running, is that either way, I'm not sure if America wins. In fact, I think America probably loses. I think we're headed for another 8 years of stagnation,
Status quo.
red and blue states, nobody agreeing to anything, Congress not being able to pass bills. That's the big worry here. You know, if it was, we've seen that for the past 8 years under President Obama. Hillary Clinton has traditionally been a polarizing figure if she winds up winning, and I think she will win. But the same would be true of Bernie Sanders. I mean, Bernie Sanders is to the left of Hillary. The Republicans will probably hold on to the House, and nothing will get done.
I think the battle really is not so much for the presidency at this point, because I can't imagine at this point it not going to the Democrats. But remember, 26 seats are up in the Senate on the Republican side. And a change there could put the momentum back in terms of numbers for the Democrats. Now, of course, the issue at hand is always that because of the gerrymandering that's been done in the House, people don't lose their seats. Now, just remember, the Supreme Court the other day ruled in Texas that, you know, the one vote, one person, and other legislation is coming into the Supreme Court, which is focusing on how districts are created. It's going to be a big factor in the next 8 to 10 years in our country, because it's so rigged on the House side that I don't see a change there. And if you have a constant situation where you have Republicans controlling the House, and even if the Democrats control the White House and the Senate, everything stops. And we have to get past that.
I completely agree with that analysis, and I think the House is absolutely safe for the Republicans. On the Democratic side, you mentioned the 26 states that are up. 6 of them are toss-up states, and they're important states. And if I can remember my numbers, I think it's 4 seats in the Senate that separate the Democrats and the Republicans right now. So it is possible that the Democrats could take back the Senate. And if that happens, that could throw my previous analysis out with the bathwater, because then you might be able to get some things done in Washington.
But you'll probably still have then 2 seats within the Supreme Court that will probably go over to the Democrats, because even if they don't allow this process to begin with Garland, that means whoever elected again, you have Garland or whoever else is placed there, but probably Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to retire.
So we shall see. It is certainly interesting and always changing. The latest big news to drop over the past week has been what's called the Panama Papers, and it's a leak of financial information about basically the financial elites offshoring money for what may be, obviously, just for tax evasion purposes, to hide the wealth. And how do you feel about that? Are there any people here that have their own offshore accounts that feel threatened by this news? Or no? Okay. I was just wondering. So with this release, we're seeing terabytes of data coming out. And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for you? So I'm going to try and connect this issue with your lives, right? So how many of you are involved in anti-drug campaigns, right? You've been doing social media for a long time now, right? your likes and your shares and the people that you associate with. You've probably been involved with DARE at some point in your academic career, right? What about Love 146, organizations like that are interested in human trafficking, stopping human trafficking? Have anybody been involved in those? The Panama Papers are, strangely enough, connected to those issues. They do have an impact on your life because we need to know, most importantly, it's not just about finding out where rich people put their money. We need to know why they're rich and why they're hiding the money. And that's pretty important. And we think there are 3 categories for that. I'm going to hand that over to Professor Falco in a second. But the 3 categories of where that money comes from are pretty important to you guys. So if you'd like to introduce those categories to us, that would be very helpful.
Well, I think it goes back to what has happened since the end of the Cold War. What you have had develop are what are called these transnational crime organizations, which have now gotten to the point where they are beyond the power of national countries to take care of it. And what I mean by that is that, the old traditional idea of the mafia going around and, shaking down somebody or whatever. We're way beyond that in terms of the amount of money they have and the power that they can now use for not just their own business. Because it's beyond one group. There are multinational ones, Russian mafia, drug cartels. But they're all starting to utilize this movement of money, and in a way that they go and look at, in particular, regions of the world where there's instability, whether it's governments, civil conflicts, to not only exploit those situations, but to use the 3 major categories which you're talking about, which is drugs, arms, and people. And the manipulation and movement of those is not just big money, it's enormous money. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. And how they use that hidden ability to hide the money, whether it's in these offshore accounts or anything, is how this destabilization continues, and how we have the situations which are existing in the world today, and how governments can't seem to stop it. Okay, so what you're having is that this going on, and now we have this illumination created through these papers as to what this is about. And people are going, oh, is that just a rich guy hiding his money? Well, think of it this way. Because we are so globally connected, okay, how does this money move and how does it affect things? And let's look at China for a second. Everybody's been talking about Putin and his $2 billion of hidden monies. But if you look at China, which has now become the second most powerful economy in the world, they're realizing that many leaders within the powers that be at China have these offshore accounts. And that money is accounting right now, they don't know, at about $700 billion. Now think of it this way. Everybody's been talking over the last couple of years that they're thinking the Chinese bubble is going to burst because of what's been going on.
The Chinese bubble, meaning that there's
economy?
a one-party system controlling everything.
That's right.
And they're spending uncontrollably, and they manipulate their currency.
And just remember that not only did they have say, it seems from outside sources that they're not really capable of addressing the issues that are coming up. And when they're moving their money, this amount of money out of the country, that's putting up, in my mind, red flags that we have to be concerned with, because the global impact on the collapse of that economy is going to have impact on all of us. And as you look down the list of things across Central and South America, which we don't even think of, thinking, oh, that's just hundreds of millions of dollars. It's all interconnected, and those interconnections are going to affect how we do things. The funny thing the other day is I saw the Obama administration just put forth legislation about what companies can do, and you probably heard that Pfizer and the Irish conglomerate, I think it's Allegra, I think is the name of them, decided not to merge. Why did they decide not to merge? Because Pfizer's goal was to move their headquarters to Ireland, where they can evade paying American tax on their income. And the fact that now they can't do that, the merger has been halted. So you see how this is a web of interconnections on how money moves. And I think the Panama Papers are just starting to scratch the surface of what we're going to see in the next couple of months.
Yeah, terabytes of data, it seems like a lot. but in terms of what's actually happening out there now, Mossack Fonseca, and don't feel bad if you've never heard Mossack Fonseca before, because if you have, you're probably stealing money or trying to find the people who have, right? So they're Kate, I think you said it was the fourth largest bank / legal firm to be helping people steal their money away, basically. If they're the fourth largest firm and they have terabytes and terabytes, 40 years of data on this, imagine what's going on in the top tier. This is nothing yet. And now, what are the implications for this? Who is being affected by this? We saw the day after these were released, this guy bit the dust. Now, this, excuse my Icelandic here, but Sigmundur Gunnlaugsson. Yeah, that was pretty good, right? Okay. He stepped down. He was asked on camera about this connection, and he got all flustered, and he got up and he said, "You're making something out of this that is not improper." And then the next day he was gone because the Icelandic people were on the streets protesting, saying, "We don't want that." So I think we're coming into a moment in history where we're moving beyond nations. And it's very scary in that regard.
Yeah,
because
think of what you bring up, because the Chinese government yesterday clamped down on their censorship to all websites feeding information into the country, right? The Putin regime has now started a campaign saying that they're just trying to discredit Putin.
this guy,
It's anti-Russian
yes,
attacks.
poor Putin is being
Right.
targeted and singled out.
So where governments can actually control the media, control the flow of content, big time they're going to be moving their operations into deflecting the content and information, or literally clamping down where people can't get access to it.
What we're talking about here in China in particular is the sons and the daughters of the highest levels of leadership in the Chinese government have been storing billions of dollars offshore. So one of the questions that you might ask is, why Panama? Why does it become? Well, Panama is kind of unique. It sits at the apex of two continents. It's between the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. It's always been a trading place. America has had a long history with Panama because of the Panama Canal. And its form of banking and taxation is based on the state of Delaware. So there's an American connection here as well with this the company has disappeared, but Mossack Fonseca, they have two offices, one in Wyoming and one in, what's the other western state that they have an office in? There are two western states that they have offices in. So all of this is slowly dripping out. You were talking before about the corporations, which is a really good point. What we're talking about is corporate inversions. And the Pfizer case was probably the biggest one that we were aware of. But there are many of them. And corporations will say, well, the reason why we have to do this is to remain competitive in the worldwide economy. And the United States has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. And that is true. It's 35%. But guess what? No company pays that 35% because there are so many tax loopholes that corporations can get it down to 15% or 10%. And you know what? That's not enough because they're all chasing 0%. That's what they're after. And that's what is the problem here, is the reform of the taxation system has to be done so that the loopholes are closed. But guess what? There is an army of accountants and lawyers who have an army of lobbyists in Washington who will fight this to the very end, to the death. And that's part of the problem as well. It's actually a little bit surprising that the Obama administration has been successful in passing things just in the past few weeks through the Treasury Department to close some of these loopholes.
Yeah, it's very interesting to remember. Romney, when he was asked to submit his income, refused to give all of it. He only gave a proportion, and they knew that he had many offshore accounts which were doing exactly the same thing. But he knew that for PR purposes, to release that information was a downhill slope for him to
And
slide.
on the media
Trump
side,
has yet to release his
that's
Right.
true. And on the
financials.
media side of all this, the way it relates to you guys, when you look at CNN.com, where is this story? This is a massive story, and it's already third down on the list on that left column that they have there. Where is it being reported? It's page 8 in the New York Times the other day. You know, the story is getting pushed down and down. Why is that? Who owns those presses? Who owns those outlets? How are they connected to this story? They have to say something about it. You know, its absence would be too conspicuous otherwise.
Okay, now we can get a good debate going, because
Here we go.
I completely disagree with what you just
Okay.
said. Having worked for one of the biggest news corporations in the United States for 30 years, I can tell you quite honestly and truly, corporate headquarters never stepped into the news division and made a decision on what we covered.
You're also talking about NBC News, which is the top tier of news.
You're talking about the New York Times.
I'm talking about CNN as well. And I'm also talking about a media landscape that is so varied and has so many outlets now. We have trouble keeping track of where these stories are coming from. But it's so partisan in the way everything is reported, the websites it comes from, the way people go to those sites. That
Yes, when you get into cable news and when you get into the internet, I completely agree with you on that point. You're talking about the reinstitution, if you will, of the partisan press, something that goes back to the founding fathers when every newspaper was owned by a political party. So this is a big change in your generation, that you've now grown up with a partisan press, which we really didn't. Well, we didn't grow up with.
I would say I didn't either.
You're younger.
Yeah, it started to bloom when I was a late teen.
But I think, to get back to what you're saying, I think where you're looking at the impact of cable news and this 24-hour cycle, it's feeding into that polarization to a point that I think is detrimental to our democracy.
It is.
And I think that the implications of that are going to have far-reaching effects on how we not only elect our government officials, but how we culturally evolve in terms of making our decisions by the information that we get. Because no longer do people go to news to get information. They tend to go to news organizations that affirm what they want to think and believe. And that's a serious change, and I don't think a healthy change.
Well, it's also the availability of the news online is immediate and on demand.
Right,
Whereas, you know, sitting down and watching TV at 6:30 at night, which is, you know, something that I grew accustomed to as a teen through my 20s, that's a foreign concept in a lot of ways. You guys if you pay any attention to the news, is it online? Okay. How many of you sit regularly and watch television news at a specific time? That's one person out of all of them compared to where the news comes to you guys over your phones or online otherwise. So that's the smorgasbord effect, right? You go and you pick what you want out of the buffet, and that's how people get their news now. It's very different than, you know, when Peter Jennings was sitting at the desk and they customized the news for the nation. Is one better than the other?
Yeah, I think actually, to take the other side of it, I think it's actually better. I think there's more information available today than ever before. But what I think hasn't happened yet is that the audience or the public has not caught up with that yet, and caught up with the idea that they have the responsibility now to be the editorial filter and to determine what is a reliable source of information and what isn't. It's all out there. We wouldn't have things like the WikiLeaks story or this Panama Papers story if there wasn't an internet, and if we couldn't disseminate information in a way that it didn't go through some kind of an elite filter system, which is what I worked for. It was an elitist filter system of journalists who decided what America would see that night at 6:30. They happened to be very good professionals with good judgment, and I think the public was served well. But I think potentially the public could be served even better today with all of the sources of information out there, as long as you know if it's reliable.
And not just chasing the lowest common denominator stories either.
That's right.
But to go back to the papers themselves in Panama, I think we have to also look at Panama and what has happened, particularly in the last 3 or 4 decades. It's notoriously been corrupt. Just remember, the president of Panama is now serving time in our jails because it was a major kingpin in the way drugs moved from the cartels into the Americas. He's now serving a very long period of time. So corruption has been a major problem there for a long time. And that kind of situation makes it very, very good for law firms, organizations, individuals who want to create these kind of under-the-wire organizations that can do what they're doing with this money.
Yeah, I mean, there's talk about income disparity in Panama. I kept thinking when these papers dropped that, you know, you have this tremendous amount of wealth in Panama for decades now, pouring in through these offshore accounts. And I kept thinking of Mariano Rivera growing up and playing baseball with a cardboard baseball, you know, and he, of course, is Panamanian.
We're going to go now to our question and answer session with students from my Media and Democracy class. Ty, take it away.
Hi, Professor Golda. I'm here with Morgan DePlone. Where are you from?
I'm from Milford, Connecticut.
Okay, she has a question for you all.
Going back to the topic of the elections, what are your thoughts and opinions on Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson, and does he have any chance going against Clinton or Trump?
I think most people would just say, who?
That's what I was going to say.
Who are you talking about? Yeah. What is the benefit of a two-party system? Doesn't it just benefit the two parties? Why isn't there a much bigger plurality of voices in this election cycle?
This is an age-old argument between our form of democracy and parliamentary democracy. As you know, I lived in Italy for 4 years, and Italy has a parliamentary system of government and a multi-party system, which absolutely ensured for decades that nothing would get done because you had no party could reach a majority.
No majorities at all.
We see it probably, you all are more aware of this in news coverage of Israel, which also has a multi-party system. So it's very, very rare that any party ever reaches a majority. So you have to form partnerships with other parties, and that tends to also break apart. Now, I would say the United Kingdom has probably had a more successful go at parliamentary democracy than most countries, but they've also had a longer time to do it. So, but to answer your question, Morgan, no chance whatsoever.
Thank you.
Because of the way the entrenched powers work, as you can see, anybody with a wide range outside of the mainstream, an opinion outside the mainstream, can't build enough consensus to push in that specific direction. So then we have, you know, maybe Sanders on the outside and Trump on the outside over there, but who's going to come together in the middle? And, you know, certainly over the past 40 years, at least in my experience, I've seen less and less and less and less cooperation, collaboration, and finally, you know, very little getting done. But isn't that really the way our government was structured? Isn't that the whole idea of checks and balances, that the only way to actually move Congress and move our political system is when it becomes really evident that it needs to happen?
Yeah, but I think we have another factor here that has to be taken into account. It's really about the money now. And the way the two-party system is set up, it sets up in a way that the money can only get to the dollars that it gets to in order to get elected in this country. That, you know, a third-party candidate, he becomes lost in that shuffle. It's now billions of dollars to become elected president. I mean, and we've had now legislation where corporations are now citizens, where it's unchecked money. I don't see how a smaller candidate has a chance at this point.
Yeah, historically, I mean, you can go all the way back to probably the most successful run of a third-party candidate, which was Teddy Roosevelt, after having been president, running on the Bull Moose Party, and he was a deeply loved president. If any of you have read the book by Doris Kearns Goodwin that came out within the last 2 years, and he didn't win as a third-party candidate. So it's almost impossible.
Thank you. Ty?
Okay, we're here with our next audience member. State your name and where you're from.
Mary from New York. Oh, my question is about the Panama files. If they were hidden for 40 years, what took them so long to be found?
There's a group called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and they've been working on these papers for over a year now. They received this leak a long time ago. and they created a database, and they all got together and took little chunks, and they all went through it, and they figured out who was implicated in this, and then they finally came out with their statement just a couple days ago. So when it comes to Putin, his name is not in those papers at all, but everybody around him all of a sudden has a lot of money in accounts that has multiple access points.
I think you have other things going on too. Okay, WikiLeaks changed a lot when they came out, not because of just the content they released, but how organizations, Anonymous and others, are using the internet, using the technology, digging in ways that it wasn't done before. And that is going to change the way this information comes out. The other thing I think that happened here, and I don't know all the details, is that you had a lot of people investigating this in different places around the world. But what this allowed was that information could be fed into one place. And I think what probably started happening is journalists were looking at, this is going on here, but now I just read that these journalists discovered this here, and I realized there's an interconnection here. Oh my gosh, a light went off.
Yeah, I was listening to a report this morning on the BBC, and they were talking about the island of Guernsey, which is also an offshore island, but with very, very strict rules and regulations. So it was being trumpeted as an example of, yes, you can have offshore, and you can have a low tax rate, but you can do it legally. The other report that they showed was in Norway, which I found absolutely fascinating. In Norway, everybody's tax records are open to the public. Everybody. So you can go and look up your boss's tax records as to what they paid. And it's a system that they've had, this kind of openness system that goes back to their founding as a country in 1814. So there are different models out there, and maybe after all of this investigation is done, it's going to require some international laws that are agreed upon by many different countries in order to stop this, because otherwise somebody will always evade it.
You bring up a good point. If it's not international law, it can't change, because then you can just have a country creating whatever they want because they're not under this umbrella of international law.
So good luck, basically.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, okay. Ty?
Hello, welcome to the show. State your name and where you're from.
Hello, I'm Erin. I'm from New York. I just wanted to ask, I think you addressed a little bit of one of my questions. I was going to say how Cayman Islands was under scrutiny for a while, and I was going to compare it. Will it change how Cayman Island did to become legal, or and also will people that were laundering this money, will they seek accountability? Will they? You see people, all these people, they've been arrested, they've been in prison for 13 years, for however long. So now that all of these papers are coming up, how are we going to deal with it? Are other people going to be arrested for it? Or are we just going to say, like, oh, well, that's okay. Like, now we have to fix that and let them go?
The short answer is yes. People are going to roll for this.
I think they're going to roll, but what you need to understand is most of these offshore accounts are legal. They're not illegal. They're not maybe ethical.
Yeah.
But where the money comes from,
Yeah.
certainly.
Now, when you're laundering money, then of course it's illegal. But I think what we're going to see as more of the information comes out about who's doing what with these papers. And remember, we just scratched the surface. They just came out, and it was what we talked about how much it is. It's going to take months to start going through this, to connect all the dots, and how that interconnection ultimately has consequences, we'll see.
What we're talking about shell companies. And the reason why they're called shell companies is because legally, in the Panama case and in previous times in the Cayman Island cases, only a manager had to be on the papers of any of these companies. So one of the big differences that I mentioned earlier in Guernsey is ownership has to be on the papers. So, for example, this is a hypothetical, I can't make an accusation, but if Putin's circle is investing this money, and it's really partially his money as well, he would be required under an international law change to be on the papers as owner. And it couldn't be some shell manager. That's a big distinction. As soon as that happens, because you can imagine in a government, just like we just saw in Iceland, if you have a leader in government who is taking money from the country and exporting it to some bank account, the population will rise up as they did in Iceland, and he was gone the next day.
Thank you. That's going to conclude this episode of Media Matrix. I'd like to thank Professor Alicastro and Professor Falco for joining us today. And let's hear it for them.